Picture this: a young nobleman standing in the ruins of his homeland, watching smoke rise from abandoned villages along the main river. His people, the Marcomanni, had just been crushed by the most powerful confederation in Germanic history. Everything they'd built over centuries, gone. Most leaders would have surrendered, most would have accepted defeat. But Maroboduus was not most leaders. This refugee prince would transform his shattered tribe into a kingdom so powerful that Rome itself would tremble at its name. This is the incredible story of the Marcomanni, the border warriors who challenged an empire. The Marcomanni emerged from the dense forests of central Germany during the turbulent 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Their name literally meant bordermen or march warriors, a title that revealed their essential role as frontier guardians along the edges of Germanic territory. They carved out their homeland along the main river valley, where thick woodlands provided natural defences and fertile soil promised abundant harvests. These weren't simple barbarians living in crude huts. Archaeological excavations have uncovered sophisticated settlements with rectangular timber-framed houses stretching up to 25 meters in length, featuring central hearths and dedicated storage areas that spoke of surplus wealth and emerging social hierarchies. Their craftsmen created pottery unlike anything their neighbors produced. Imagine artisans carefully inscribing angular geometric patterns into clay vessels, intricate designs of triangles, diamonds, and parallel grooves that identified Marcomannic work across hundreds of kilometers. Some storage jars stood as tall as a man's chest, decorated with horizontal bands of impressed chord markings and fingertip indentations. These massive containers weren't just beautiful, they were necessary for storing the grain surpluses that separated prosperous societies from struggling ones. The Marcomanni had clearly mastered the art of abundance, but their most impressive skill wasn't pottery, it was iron. The Marcomannic blacksmiths were legendary. They'd perfected bloomery furnaces, clay-lined shafts about 1 meter high, with carefully constructed bellows systems that could reach temperatures hot enough to transform raw ore into workable iron. What they created from these furnaces changed warfare itself. Their spear points featured distinctive socketed construction with reinforcing ribs that could punch through shields and armor. Their long swords displayed pattern-welded blades, a technique so advanced it involved folding different types of iron together repeatedly, creating weapons that combined hard cutting edges with flexible cores that wouldn't shatter in battle. These weren't just tools, they were masterpieces that took years to learn how to forge. But who were these people beyond their impressive metalwork? Marcomannic society operated on a clear three-tiered system that archaeologists can still read in their burial grounds today. Elite burials, about 10% of the population, contained complete weapon sets, imported Roman bronze vessels, amber jewelry, and occasionally gold ornaments. These wealthy graves featured wooden burial chambers 3 meters by 2 meters, surrounded by ditched enclosures that required massive labor investments. The message was clear. Some Marcomanni were very important people. The middle tier, representing about 30% of burials, received more modest treatment with iron knives, bronze brooches, ceramic vessels, and occasionally single weapons like spears or shields. Even the simplest graves showed evidence of careful preparation and community involvement, suggesting that while hierarchy existed, it didn't mean complete marginalization of common folk. The Marcomanni practiced sacred rituals that reveal their warrior culture's spiritual dimension. In wetlands near their settlements, they deliberately deposited weapons as offerings to their gods, complete shield bosses, spear points, and sword fragments that show evidence of intentional destruction through bending and breaking before placement. Why destroy perfectly good weapons? This wasn't wastefulness, it was sacrifice, transforming tools of war into gifts for the divine powers they believed controlled victory and defeat. These weren't people who took warfare lightly. Every battle, every weapon, every warrior existed within a web of sacred meaning that connected the earthly struggle to cosmic forces beyond human understanding. What happened next would test their faith to its absolute limits. The year 113 BC shattered the Marcomannic world forever. From the distant Jutland Peninsula came the Cimbri and Teutones, massive tribal confederations sweeping southward like an unstoppable tsunami of humanity. These weren't organized armies in the Roman sense. They were entire peoples on the move. Warriors, yes, but also women, children, elders, livestock, and everything their tribes owned loaded onto thousands of wagons. Imagine the sound, hundreds of thousands of people and animals creating a din that could be heard for kilometers, and they were heading straight through Marcomannic territory. Archaeological evidence tells the brutal story. Along the main river, major settlements show clear signs of disruption around 110 BC. At Bamberg, excavators discovered a layer of ash and debris, followed by a distinct gap in occupation, lasting approximately 2 decades. Similar patterns appear at sites near Würzburg and Schweinfurt. This wasn't gradual abandonment where people slowly drifted away. This was coordinated evacuation, entire communities packing whatever they could carry and fleeing westward. The Marcomanni faced an impossible choice: stay and be destroyed, or abandon everything they'd built and seek survival elsewhere. Their leaders chose survival. The westward migration transformed the Marcomanni from settled agriculturalists into mobile warrior bands. Following the Tauber and Neckar river systems, they left behind distinctive pottery shards and metalwork at temporary campsites, archaeological breadcrumbs marking their desperate journey. These weren't permanent settlements requiring careful construction and planning. These were overnight camps with rapid shelter construction using portable materials. Every day brought uncertainty. Every river crossing risked attack. Every decision could mean life or death for thousands. But the Marcomanni were about to encounter someone who would change their fortunes dramatically. His name was Ariovistus, and he was building something unprecedented in Germanic history, a confederation that could challenge Rome itself. The border warriors were about to become kingmakers. Ariovistus was unlike any Germanic leader the Marcomanni had ever encountered. This charismatic Swabi war chief combined traditional warrior culture with something far more dangerous: political genius. While most Germanic chieftains governed through kinship networks and inherited authority, Ariovistus built his power base through military success and the ability to coordinate multiple tribal groups toward common objectives. When the displaced Marcomanni encountered his forces around 108 BC in the Upper Rhine region, they didn't find a rival, they found a visionary who recognized their value immediately. The Marcomanni brought something priceless to Ariovistus's confederation: experience. They'd observed Roman military tactics during the latter stages of the Cimbrian Wars. They understood how legions moved, how they organized supply lines, how they constructed their infamous marching camps each night. This intelligence was gold. Ariovistus didn't just accept the Marcomanni as refugees, he elevated them to elite status within his growing confederation, deploying them as shock troops and strategic advisors. Archaeological evidence from Alsace shows Germanic settlements dating to approximately 90 BC, featuring characteristic Swabi construction techniques combined with defensive innovations that suggest Roman influence, innovations the Marcomanni had brought with them. The confederation Ariovistus forged represented evolution in Germanic political organization. Previous alliances typically formed around specific military objectives, a particular raid or seasonal campaign, then dissolved once goals were achieved. Ariovistus created something more permanent, a structure that maintained tribal identity while coordinating strategic planning and resource allocation across multiple groups. The Marcomanni occupied a prominent position in this new order, serving not just as warriors but as architects of a military system that could genuinely threaten Rome. But power breeds ambition, and ambition breeds enemies. What the Confederation did next would bring them face to face with the greatest military mind Rome had ever produced, and the collision would reshape Europe forever. By 72 BC, the Germanic Confederation under Ariovistus controlled vast territories in eastern Gaul. They'd been invited, yes, invited, by the Sequani, a Gallic tribe seeking military assistance against their rivals, the Aedui. The deal seemed simple. The Sequani would grant the Confederation rights to approximately 1/3 of their territory in exchange for military support. But deals with ambitious warlords rarely stay simple. What began as a mercenary arrangement rapidly transformed into occupation. The Marcomanni played crucial roles in this territorial expansion, utilizing their organizational skills and military experience to coordinate settlement establishment and defensive preparations. Their knowledge of Roman engineering techniques proved invaluable in constructing fortifications capable of withstanding professional siege warfare. The Germanic settlers weren't just warriors camping temporarily. Archaeological evidence from sites near Besançon shows rapid construction of substantial Germanic settlements featuring characteristic timber-framed architecture and defensive earthworks. These housed entire family groups, women, children, craftsmen, farmers. This was colonization, not temporary deployment, and Ariovistus kept demanding more. Eventually he claimed 2/3 of Sequani territory while simultaneously pressuring neighboring tribes for similar concessions. The Aedui, recognizing existential threat, abandoned their conflict with the Sequani and did something desperate. They asked Rome for help. The plea reached the Senate at precisely the wrong moment, or perhaps exactly the right moment, depending on your perspective. Julius Caesar had just assumed his proconsular command in Gaul in 58 BC, and he was hungry for military glory that would elevate him to the pinnacle of Roman power. The Aedui request provided perfect justification for intervention. Caesar marched north with 4 legions of Rome's finest troops. Ariovistus, confident in his confederation's military prowess, agreed to meet the Romans in battle near the Vosges Mountains. It was the worst decision he ever made. The battle that followed would haunt the Marcomanni for generations. Everything they'd built was about to come crashing down in a single, catastrophic afternoon. The Battle of Vosges in 58 BC lasted only a few hours, but its consequences echoed for decades. Caesar's legions, employing superior discipline and tactical coordination, systematically dismantled Ariovistus's forces in a devastating display of professional military power. The Marcomanni, serving as elite shock troops, fought with desperate courage at the Confederation's center. But courage couldn't overcome the grinding efficiency of Roman formation fighting. When Germanic defensive lines finally collapsed, thousands of warriors lay dead on the battlefield. The survivors, including the entire Marcomannic population that had followed the Confederation west, scattered in desperate flight back toward the Rhine, abandoning settlements, families, and territorial ambitions. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements in Alsace paints a haunting picture of hasty evacuation. At sites near Strasbourg and Colmar, valuable items were left behind, storage facilities deliberately destroyed to prevent Roman exploitation. Layers of ash and debris dating to 58-57 BC indicate systematic destruction of Germanic infrastructure as survivors retreated eastward. The Marcomanni found themselves reduced to refugee status once again, competing for limited Rhine crossing points while Roman cavalry pursued stragglers. Everything they'd achieved under Ariovistus, the status, the prosperity, the power, vanished like morning mist. But from disaster came opportunity. During this chaos, a young Marcomannic nobleman named Maroboduus began gathering survivors. Born around 30 BC into the tribal aristocracy, he'd spent his formative years within Ariovistus's confederation. gaining exposure to both Germanic warrior traditions and Roman military methods. Unlike typical war leaders who relied solely on personal combat prowess and charismatic authority, Maroboduus demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political organization and long-term strategic planning. He possessed something rare, the ability to learn from catastrophic defeat rather than be destroyed by it. As he organized surviving Marcomannic warriors and their families into disciplined columns capable of sustained movement, veterans who'd served under Ariovistus recognized leadership qualities that transcended mere battlefield courage. The border warriors had found their champion, but what came next would surprise everyone, including Rome itself. By 15 BC, Maroboduus had consolidated sufficient support among Marcomannic survivors to challenge existing tribal leadership structures. The traditional chiefs, who'd governed before the Gallic adventure, had either died in battle or lost credibility through their association with the failed confederation. Maroboduus filled this leadership vacuum by presenting a coherent vision for Marcomannic recovery and future prosperity. But his plan was audacious. He wanted to move the entire tribe to Bohemia, hundreds of kilometers to the east. Why Bohemia? Geography. The region offered natural defensive barriers through the Bohemian Massif's mountain ranges, while the Elbe river system provided access to northern European trade networks. Most importantly, it was far enough from Roman frontiers to rebuild without immediate interference. The migration to Bohemia around 8 BC required extraordinary logistical coordination. Maroboduus organized the movement in stages, establishing temporary camps along river routes, while advanced parties secured crossing points and negotiated passage rights with local populations. Archaeological evidence documents this migration through distinctive Marcomannic pottery assemblages appearing suddenly in the Bohemian archaeological record. Excavations near modern Prague reveal substantial settlements featuring characteristic timber-framed architecture adapted for local conditions. These weren't desperate refugee camps, they were planned communities with designated areas for craft production, weapon storage, and administrative functions. Upon reaching Bohemia, Maroboduus implemented the most controversial decision of his career. Around 9 BC, he proclaimed himself king, rex in Latin sources, establishing centralized control that concentrated military, judicial, and religious authority in his person. This shattered traditional Germanic political practices that emphasized consensus-based leadership and warrior democracy. Tribal traditionalists viewed monarchical government as incompatible with Germanic customs. But Maroboduus argued persuasively that extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. The catastrophic defeat at Vosges had proven that traditional tribal organization couldn't compete with Roman military power. Survival required transformation, and he was just getting started. What he built next would become the most powerful Germanic kingdom north of the Danube, a state so formidable that even Augustus Caesar would negotiate with it as an equal. But then catastrophe struck. Maroboduus's capital, near modern Prague, became the beating heart of Germanic power in Central Europe. Built on elevated terrain overlooking the confluence of the Vltava and Elbe rivers, the site provided excellent visibility across surrounding countryside, while offering multiple escape routes if besieged. But this wasn't just a military stronghold, it was a city by Germanic standards. Excavations reveal a complex of timber-framed buildings arranged around central courtyards with specialized structures for administrative functions, weapon production, and religious ceremonies. The royal residence itself measured approximately 40 meters by 25 meters, featuring multiple rooms with elaborate interior decorations, including carved wooden panels and bronze fittings imported from Roman territories. This was power made visible in wood and iron. The kingdom's military reforms represented Maroboduus's most significant innovation. He recognized that future conflicts with Rome would require capabilities far exceeding typical tribal war bands, so he created something unprecedented, a professional Germanic army. The reformed military retained traditional elements like individual warrior prowess and clan-based unit organization, but introduced Roman-influenced innovations, standardized equipment, coordinated formation fighting, and systematic training programs. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits near the capital reveals standardized spear points measuring 25-30 centimeters in length with reinforced sockets, shield bosses featuring uniform bronze reinforcement patterns, and long swords with pattern-welded blades. This wasn't individual warriors bringing whatever weapons they owned. This was centralized production ensuring every soldier met the same high standards. Training facilities established throughout the kingdom provided systematic instruction in both traditional Germanic combat methods and Roman-influenced tactical formations. These installations, identified through excavation, featured practice areas for individual weapons training and larger spaces for formation drills. The comprehensive nature of these programs reflected Maroboduus's commitment to creating military forces capable of facing Roman legions on equal terms. Contemporary Roman sources, particularly Tacitus's detailed military assessments, estimated total Marcomannic military potential at approximately 70,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, the largest Germanic force north of the Danube. But numbers meant nothing without diplomatic skill, and what happened next would test Maroboduus's political genius to its absolute limits. Around 6 BC, Roman envoys reached Maroboduus's capital to assess the kingdom's military capabilities and political intentions. Augustus Caesar, having completed the conquest of Gaul and initiated campaigns against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, recognized that this Marcomannic kingdom represented both potential threat and valuable buffer against more hostile tribes further north. The negotiations that followed demonstrated Maroboduus's sophisticated diplomatic skills. Rather than demanding tribute as a sign of submission, Augustus offered a formal agreement that recognized Marcomannic territorial claims in Bohemia while establishing mutual cooperation arrangements. Maroboduus gained international recognition of his kingdom's legitimacy while avoiding direct military confrontation. It was a masterful diplomatic victory, but maintaining this delicate balance required constant attention. The tribute arrangements involved annual payments of valuable goods, amber, furs, iron products, and occasionally Germanic warriors for auxiliary military service. These payments represented a form of subordination to Roman authority, yet provided access to Roman markets and diplomatic protection against hostile neighbors. Archaeological evidence from the capital shows increased quantities of Roman luxury goods during this period: bronze vessels, glass beads, wine amphorae, even occasionally silver coins. The kingdom was prospering through its relationship with Rome, not despite it. The diplomatic equilibrium attracted numerous Germanic tribes, seeking protection from Roman expansion and political stability. The Quadi, occupying fertile Moravian plains east of Bohemia, formally acknowledged Marcomannic supremacy around 5 AD. Their territory encompassed the strategic Morava River Valley, providing crucial access to Danubian trade routes. Archaeological evidence from Quadi settlements shows sudden appearance of Marcomannic-style pottery and metalwork, indicating rapid cultural integration following political submission. Other tribes followed the Cotini with their valuable salt production facilities, various Slovakic groups along the upper Danube tributaries. By 6 AD, Maroboduus's kingdom encompassed territories stretching from Bohemia through Moravia into western Slovakia, with tributary relationships extending even further. He'd built something unprecedented, a Germanic superpower. But empires built on one man's genius often struggled to survive his departure, and internal enemies were already sharpening their knives in the darkness. Picture the Marcomannic court around 15 AD. On the surface, everything appeared magnificent, prosperity flowing from tribute relationships, military strength unmatched north of the Danube, diplomatic recognition from Rome itself. But beneath this gleaming exterior, resentment festered like an infected wound. Traditional tribal leaders who'd governed through kinship networks and warrior assemblies viewed Maroboduus's monarchical system as betrayal of Germanic customs. His centralized administration, while effective for rapid territorial expansion, had gradually alienated nobles who felt excluded from power, and ambitious rivals were watching, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Catualda emerged as the most formidable opposition leader. Born into Marcomannic nobility around 25 BC, he'd spent his youth within traditional tribal structures before Maroboduus's rise to power, developing strong connections with conservative factions who opposed the kingdom's Roman-influenced administrative innovations. His family lineage traced back to pre-migration Marcomannic chieftains, providing legitimate claims to leadership that resonated with traditionalist supporters. Catualda's message was simple and powerful: return to Germanic warrior democracy, reduce tribute payments to Rome, restore local autonomy to tribal leaders. It found eager audiences among those who'd watched their traditional authority erode under royal centralization. The factional struggles erupting around 17 AD reflected deeper cultural tensions between modernizing and traditionalist elements within Marcomannic society. Archaeological evidence reveals these political divisions in material culture. Sites associated with Catualda's supporters show deliberate rejection of Roman-influenced artifacts and architectural styles, with construction projects reverting to traditional Germanic building techniques. Pottery assemblages display increased emphasis on indigenous design elements. This wasn't just political opposition, it was cultural resistance against what traditionalists viewed as contamination of Germanic authenticity. Regional assemblies organized by opposition leaders provided forums for expressing grievances against royal policies. These gatherings, conducted according to ancient Germanic customs requiring consensus among participating warriors, offered stark contrast to Maroboduus's administrative methods that concentrated decision-making authority in royal officials. The assembly's democratic character attracted supporters who felt marginalized by centralized government. But assemblies and pottery styles wouldn't determine the kingdom's fate. That would be decided through violence. What happened next would change everything. The spring of 19 AD brought civil war to the Marcomannic kingdom. Catualda's rebellion began with coordinated attacks on royal administrative centers and tribute collection facilities throughout the realm, sophisticated planning indicating months of preparation by opposition forces. Archaeological evidence from sites near Prague shows destruction layers dating to this period, with deliberate targeting of governmental buildings and royal storage facilities, while residential areas remained largely undamaged. This wasn't mindless violence, it was surgical strike designed to cripple royal authority while minimizing civilian casualties that might turn popular opinion against the rebels. The rebellion's initial success stemmed from widespread popular support among tribal groups experiencing increasing taxation under centralized government. Regional chieftains provided local knowledge and logistical support that enabled rapid movement across familiar territory while avoiding royal military concentrations. Catualda's forces included substantial numbers of allied tribal warriors who viewed the civil war as opportunity to regain traditional autonomy. The military stalemate that developed revealed the kingdom's deep internal divisions. Royal forces retained advantages in standardized equipment and coordinated formations, but opposition supporters utilized guerrilla tactics and local support networks that neutralized these advantages in familiar terrain. Meanwhile, a parallel drama was unfolding along the Rhine frontier. Arminius, the Cherusci war leader, who'd achieved legendary status through his victory over Varus at the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, was attempting to forge a grand alliance of Germanic tribes against Roman expansion. He recognized that sustainable resistance required coordination among major Germanic political entities, and the Marcomannic kingdom represented the most crucial potential ally. Initial diplomatic contact occurred during winter 16 to 17 AD, when reduced military activity provided opportunities for extended negotiations. But the discussions revealed fundamental differences in strategic priorities that complicated alliance formation despite shared opposition to Roman expansion. Arminius advocated aggressive military campaigns to expel Roman forces from all Germanic territories. Maroboduus preferred defensive strategies, preserving his kingdom's territorial integrity without risking catastrophic military defeat. Weren't just tactical disagreements, they reflected completely different philosophies about appropriate relationships with Roman power, and while they argued, both their kingdoms were tearing themselves apart from within. By late 19th AD, Catualda's forces, reinforced by Suebi allies from across the Elbe, launched their decisive assault on Maroboduus's capital. The battle demonstrated tactical evolution that had occurred during the Civil War, with both sides employing siege warfare techniques and coordinated infantry operations reflecting Roman military influence. But superior numbers and local support enabled Catualda's forces to overwhelm royal defenses. Imagine Maroboduus standing in his burning capital, watching everything he'd built over 2 decades collapse around him. The loyal warriors who'd followed him from Gaul, through the migration to Bohemia, through the construction of a kingdom, now scattered or dead. His sophisticated administration destroyed. His dream of Germanic power that could negotiate with Rome as an equal shattered. Maroboduus made the hardest decision of his life. Rather than fight to the death in a futile last stand, he chose survival. With his remaining loyal supporters, he fled south toward the Danube frontier and threw himself on Roman mercy. Augustus Caesar, recognizing that a refugee Marcomannic king might prove useful as a diplomatic tool, granted him asylum in Ravenna. There, Maroboduus would spend the next 18 years of his life, a king without a kingdom, watching from comfortable exile as everything he'd created disintegrated. He died in 37 AD, far from the Bohemian forests he'd transformed into the center of Germanic power. History remembers him as one of the great might-have-beens, a leader whose vision exceeded his ability to maintain it. Catualda's victory proved hollow. Within months of seizing power, he faced the same challenges that had plagued Maroboduus: how to maintain unity among diverse tribal groups with competing interests. Archaeological evidence shows that his rule lasted barely a year before he too was overthrown and forced to seek Roman protection. The pattern was becoming clear. Germanic kingdoms built on personal authority collapsed when that authority disappeared. Rome watched this chaos with calculating eyes. The fragmentation of the most powerful Germanic political entity north of the Danube created both opportunity and danger. What Roman officials decided next would shape Central European politics for the next century and a half. Rather than attempting direct territorial occupation, which would have required substantial military resources and risked provoking broader Germanic resistance, Roman officials pursued divide-and-control strategies. In 20 AD, they installed Vannius and Sido as client rulers, creating a deliberate partition of former Marcomannic territories. Vannius received authority over western regions, including much of Bohemia, while Sido controlled eastern territories encompassing parts of Moravia and Slovakia. Both rulers possessed sufficient tribal connections to command local legitimacy, but lacked resources necessary for challenging Roman authority or reunifying divided territories. Rome had learned an important lesson. It was easier to control fragmented Germanic tribes than unified kingdoms. The installation created competitive dynamics that prevented cooperation while ensuring continued dependence on Roman diplomatic support. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the immediate consequences of partition. In Bohemian sites dating to 2030 AD, excavators find widespread settlement abandonment, with many locations showing signs of hasty evacuation. rather than gradual decline. Storage pits left unsealed, valuable metalwork abandoned in workshops, defensive fortifications deliberately dismantled. These suggest organized withdrawal rather than catastrophic destruction. Where were people going? Some fled westward toward Alemannic territories along the Upper Rhine. Others sought integration with Gothic confederations expanding from the east. The demographic upheaval extended far beyond immediate civil war participants. Vannius's Western Kingdom inherited remnants of Maroboduus's governmental infrastructure, including administrative buildings and craft production centers near Prague. His administration maintained approximately 15,000 warriors, substantially fewer than the former kingdom's peak strength, but sufficient for internal order and fulfilling Roman military cooperation obligations. Sido's eastern territories faced greater challenges due to peripheral position and reduced access to established infrastructure. His kingdom's economic base relied heavily on livestock production and mineral extraction rather than agricultural surplus. Archaeological evidence from eastern sites shows more dramatic changes in material culture during this period, with traditional Marcomannic pottery styles replaced by diverse regional variants reflecting cultural fragmentation. The proud border warriors who'd once challenged Rome now found themselves pawns in imperial frontier policy. But beneath the surface, demographic pressures were building that would eventually explode into the most devastating Germanic invasion Rome had ever faced. For nearly 150 years after Maroboduus's fall, the Marcomanni existed as fragmented client kingdoms under Roman oversight. They weren't conquered subjects. They retained internal autonomy, their own rulers, their traditional customs. But they paid tribute to Rome, provided warriors for Roman auxiliary units, and accepted Roman garrisons at strategic locations. It was comfortable subjugation wrapped in the language of friendship and alliance. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing adoption of Roman customs, pottery styles incorporating Mediterranean influences, architectural techniques borrowing Roman engineering principles, burial practices reflecting Roman legal concepts. The Marcomanni were gradually becoming Romanized, or so it appeared. Beneath this peaceful facade, demographic pressures were mounting throughout the 80s and 90s AD as population recovery reached levels straining available agricultural resources. Archaeological surveys document increasing settlement density with new communities established in previously marginal lands requiring intensive cultivation. Simultaneously, massive tribal movements in northern and eastern Europe began generating pressure against the client kingdom's boundaries. Gothic peoples expanding westward from Pontic steppes displaced established Germanic populations, creating a demographic cascade that would eventually reach Roman frontier zones. Imagine dominoes falling in slow motion across hundreds of kilometers, each displaced tribe pushing against the next, creating inexorable pressure toward the only direction with space, south into Roman territory. The Marcomanni found themselves caught between Gothic expansion from the east and Roman frontiers to the south. Their client rulers faced impossible choices: accept Gothic domination, flee westward, and abandon ancestral territories, or challenge Rome's frontier restrictions and seek new lands within the empire. By the 160s AD, all three options were being actively pursued by different Marcomannic factions, but one group, the largest, most organized, and most desperate, chose the most dramatic solution. They would invade the Roman Empire itself. Not as raiders seeking quick plunder, but as entire populations seeking permanent new homelands. What happened next would shake Rome to its very foundations and require the personal intervention of its philosopher-emperor. The stage was set for the Marcomannic Wars. The year 166 AD exploded with violence. A massive confederation of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatian cavalry, and various smaller groups launched coordinated assaults across the Danube frontier. The initial breakthrough occurred near modern Vienna, where Marcomannic forces overwhelmed Roman border fortifications through sheer numerical superiority. This wasn't a typical barbarian raid. Contemporary Roman sources describe Germanic forces numbering approximately 100,000 warriors organized into disciplined formations, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of Roman military weaknesses. Years of planning had gone into this offensive. Years of stockpiling weapons, coordinating between tribes, studying Roman defensive systems through spies and former auxiliary soldiers who knew those systems intimately. Archaeological evidence from destroyed Roman settlements along the Danube shows extensive burning and deliberate destruction dating to this period. Coin hoards hastily buried by fleeing civilians provide precise chronological markers for the invasion's devastating impact. The fortress at Carnuntum, the primary Roman installation controlling the Danube crossing near Vienna, fell after several days of intense combat. Excavations have revealed arrowheads embedded in wooden structures, scattered military equipment abandoned during evacuation, and destruction layers containing burned grain stores and collapsed buildings. When Carnuntum fell, the entire middle Danube frontier lay exposed. Germanic forces spread rapidly throughout the Pannonian provinces, with raiding columns penetrating as far south as the Italian Alps. These weren't mindless destructive raids, they were systematic operations targeting Roman military installations, destroying communication networks, and capturing strategic resources while generally avoiding unnecessary conflict with civilian populations who offered no resistance. This selective approach maximized material gains while minimizing casualties, indicating strategic thinking extending beyond immediate plunder objectives. Roman civilian populations experienced unprecedented disruption. Archaeological evidence from villa sites in Austria shows hasty abandonment with valuable items buried in concealment pits while buildings were left with doors standing open. The economic impact extended far beyond the immediate war zone, as disruption of trade networks created shortages throughout northern provinces. The amber routes connecting Baltic production areas with Mediterranean markets were completely severed. What happened next would change everything. Marcus Aurelius received news of the Germanic breakthrough while campaigning against Parthian forces in the eastern provinces. The philosopher-emperor faced a strategic crisis requiring immediate redeployment of military resources from multiple frontier sectors. His decision to abandon the Parthian campaign and concentrate imperial military resources against the Germanic threat reflected accurate assessment of relative dangers. This wasn't just about defending provincial territories, it was about preventing the complete collapse of Rome's northern frontier system. If Germanic success encouraged similar attacks throughout the empire's borders, Roman territorial integrity itself might dissolve. The emperor's response began with systematic reorganization of command structures along the Danube frontier. He appointed Claudius Pompeianus, a seasoned general with extensive Germanic warfare experience, as supreme commander of Danubian operations with authority over all military forces between Rhine and Black Sea. New legionary commands were established with the 2nd Adiutrix and 14th Gemina legions transferred from Rhine frontier duties, while the newly formed 3rd Italica legion was stationed at Castra Regina. These deployments represented approximately 45,000 additional troops, a massive commitment demonstrating imperial determination to achieve decisive victory. But troops needed supplies, and supplies needed infrastructure. Roman engineering capabilities proved crucial. Archaeological surveys along military roads built during this period reveal sophisticated techniques enabling rapid troop movement and efficient supply distribution across difficult terrain. Forward operating bases projected military power into Germanic territories while providing secure positions for launching counter-offensive operations. These installations, typically located on elevated terrain overlooking major river crossings, featured extensive fortifications designed to withstand siege warfare. By 168 AD, when Marcus Aurelius personally assumed command of military operations, the strategic balance was shifting. Roman professional military organization was gradually overcoming initial Germanic numerical advantages. The Battle of Carnuntum in early 169 AD marked the first major Roman victory. Approximately 35,000 Roman troops engaged a Germanic army of similar size in a brutal engagement demonstrating Roman tactical superiority. But victory came at terrible cost, and the war was far from over. The siege of Luguricio in 170 AD demonstrated Roman advantages in sustained siege warfare. Legionary engineers constructed elaborate circumvallation works, preventing Germanic relief efforts while maintaining Roman supply lines. The siege lasted approximately 4 months before Germanic defenders agreed to surrender terms requiring evacuation of Roman territories and provision of hostages. But just when Roman victory seemed inevitable, disaster struck. During siege operations of 172 AD, Roman forces experienced severe supply difficulties due to extended drought conditions reducing water availability throughout the campaign zone. Germanic forces attempted to exploit Roman logistical vulnerabilities by attacking supply convoys and destroying water sources behind Roman lines. Something extraordinary happened, what Romans called the rain miracle. During Marcus Aurelius's campaign against the Quadi, sudden thunderstorms provided crucial water supplies to Roman forces facing severe dehydration in the Moravian plains. Contemporary accounts describe the dramatic psychological impact of unexpected rainfall, which Roman soldiers interpreted as divine intervention supporting their military efforts. News of the miracle spread throughout Roman territories, providing powerful propaganda that enhanced imperial prestige while demonstrating divine approval for the Germanic campaigns. Germanic morale suffered correspondingly, as reports of Roman divine favor circulated among tribal populations already experiencing military defeats and territorial losses. Archaeological evidence from Germanic religious sites shows increased ritual activity during this period, weapon sacrifices and elaborate ceremonies designed to regain divine favor. But these efforts failed to restore confidence in ultimate victory. The psychological impact influenced both Roman and Germanic societies profoundly. Roman forces interpreted the event as confirmation of ultimate victory, encouraging aggressive tactics despite logistical challenges. Germanic warriors began questioning their leadership's assurances of divine support, while experiencing growing doubt about their confederation's ability to achieve lasting territorial gains. By late 174 AD, the confederation's military situation had deteriorated to the point where continued resistance threatened complete annihilation. Archaeological evidence from Germanic camps abandoned during this period shows hasty evacuation with valuable weapons and personal equipment left behind, indicating desperate circumstances forcing tribal armies to prioritize speed over material preservation. The collapse was accelerating, but one final tragedy awaited before peace could come. The collapse of Germanic resistance accelerated during 175 AD, when internal disputes within Confederation leadership created fatal divisions preventing coordinated defensive planning. The Sarmatian cavalry units, whose mobility had provided crucial tactical advantages during initial breakthrough operations, withdrew from joint operations to protect their own territorial holdings along Pannonian plains. Archaeological evidence from former Confederation camps shows distinct phases of abandonment, with Sarmatian horse equipment disappearing from sites several months before Germanic infantry gear, confirming the chronological sequence of Allied withdrawals. Roman diplomatic efforts demonstrated sophisticated understanding of tribal political dynamics, as imperial negotiators successfully exploited existing tensions to accelerate Confederation disintegration. Marcus Aurelius authorized selective amnesty arrangements for tribal groups willing to abandon the Confederation and accept tributary status, creating powerful incentives for defection while isolating the most determined resistance elements. The Quadi leadership proved most receptive to Roman peace overtures. Their negotiations with Claudius Pompeianus during winter 175–176 AD established precedents for peace arrangements that would eventually encompass the entire region. The final Marcomannic resistance collapsed in early 177 AD when sustained Roman pressure eliminated the last strongholds capable of supporting organized military operations. The decisive engagement occurred near the confluence of the Morava and Danube rivers, where approximately 8,000 Marcomannic warriors made their final stand against overwhelming Roman forces numbering nearly 25,000 legionaries and auxiliaries. Archaeological excavations at the battlefield site reveal extensive Germanic casualties with mass burial pits containing hundreds of warrior skeletons showing evidence of wounds consistent with Roman military equipment, gladius thrusts and pilum impacts. Personal ornaments and weapons recovered from burials demonstrate that the final resistance included elite Marcomannic warriors who chose death over surrender, reflecting cultural values that had sustained Germanic military traditions throughout the prolonged conflict. It was the end of Marcomannic independence, but the story wasn't quite finished. One final twist of fate would determine whether Rome consolidated its victory or threw it away. Marcus Aurelius died at Vindobona in March 180 AD, just as final peace negotiations were reaching conclusion. The philosopher-emperor's death occurred at a critical moment. He'd apparently been planning systematic territorial annexation that would have fundamentally altered the demographic balance along the Danube frontier. His son, Commodus, who assumed imperial authority with limited military experience and different strategic priorities, proved more interested in concluding Germanic campaigns quickly than implementing long-term strategic advantages. This shift in imperial policy had profound consequences for final peace arrangements. Commodus's peace terms, negotiated during summer 180 AD, reflected his desire to achieve rapid conflict resolution while avoiding administrative burdens associated with governing newly conquered Germanic territories. Rather than implementing direct Roman rule over defeated tribal lands, the emperor established tributary relationships maintaining nominal tribal autonomy while ensuring Roman strategic control through hostage arrangements and military service obligations. The agreements required Marcomannic and Quadi leadership to provide annual tribute payments, surrender designated numbers of warriors for Roman auxiliary service, and accept permanent Roman garrisons at strategic locations throughout their territories. The tribute obligations imposed substantial economic burdens on defeated populations, requiring annual payments totaling approximately one-third of estimated tribal production capacity. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements during the immediate post-war period shows significant changes in material culture reflecting these economic pressures. Luxury goods disappearing from household assemblages, while basic pottery and metalwork display reduced quality. Military service obligations required Germanic tribes to provide approximately 13,000 warriors annually for Roman auxiliary units, representing a significant proportion of their total military-age male population. These levies served multiple Roman strategic objectives, removing potential military threats from Germanic territories while providing experienced warriors for frontier defense. But the most dramatic demographic intervention came through forced resettlement programs. Commodus authorized relocation of approximately 40,000 Marcomannic and Quadi civilians to designated areas within Roman provinces, primarily along the Danube frontier, where they could provide agricultural labor while serving as human buffers against future tribal incursions. The proud border warriors were being systematically dismantled as a military threat. What came next would be gradual absorption into the empire they'd once challenged. The resettlement sites, located primarily in Pannonia and Noricum, featured planned village layouts combining Roman urban planning principles with Germanic architectural traditions. Excavations near modern Szombathely and Klagenfurt reveal rectangular timber-framed houses arranged along straight streets with central areas designated for community gatherings and craft production. The settlements included Roman-style public buildings such as bathhouses and administrative centres, indicating systematic efforts to integrate Germanic populations into provincial society while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. It was cultural engineering on a massive scale. Germanic auxiliary units formed from resettled populations served throughout the Roman Empire during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Military equipment recovered from Germanic auxiliary camps displays hybrid characteristics, combining traditional Germanic weapon designs with Roman standardization requirements, reflecting cultural adaptation as tribal warriors integrated into imperial military structures. Inscriptions from auxiliary tombstones provide personal details about individual Germanic soldiers, revealing their origins, service records, and family relationships, demonstrating successful integration into Roman military society. The gradual adoption of Roman customs occurred through multiple channels: military service, economic interaction, and administrative integration, exposing tribal populations to Roman cultural practices and legal systems. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlements within Roman provinces shows increasing adoption of Roman-style pottery, architectural techniques, and burial practices during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. The cultural transformation proceeded gradually, with traditional Germanic elements persisting alongside Roman innovations rather than being completely replaced. Roman villa construction in former Germanic territories represented systematic colonization, transforming the regional landscape. Archaeological surveys throughout Austria and Western Slovakia document establishment of numerous villa complexes during late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, featuring characteristic Roman architectural elements, including hypocaust heating systems, mosaic floors, and elaborate bath facilities. The introduction of Christianity among Germanic populations began during the early 3rd century through contact with Roman military personnel and civilian administrators. Archaeological evidence for early Christian influence appears in Germanic burial sites, where traditional grave goods are replaced by Christian symbols and burial orientations reflecting Christian theological beliefs. The proud warriors who'd once threatened Rome were becoming Romans themselves. But history had one more surprise in store. The comfortable subjugation didn't last. During the crisis of the 3rd century, beginning around 235 AD, with Emperor Severus Alexander's assassination, the Roman Empire experienced unprecedented political instability, creating opportunities for Germanic intervention in imperial affairs. Rapid succession of short-lived emperors combined with simultaneous military pressures along multiple frontiers and severe economic disruption weakened Roman military capabilities precisely when Germanic populations were achieving their greatest military sophistication through decades of service in Roman auxiliary forces. The Marcomanni had learned everything Rome could teach them about warfare. Now they were about to use that knowledge against their teachers. The anti-Roman coalitions forming during the 240s included not only traditional Germanic tribal groups but also Sarmatian cavalry units, Gothic infantry formations, and various smaller tribal contingents displaced by demographic pressures from the east. This multi-ethnic military alliance demonstrated organizational sophistication exceeding previous Germanic confederations, with coordinated command structures allocating specific tactical roles to different tribal groups based on their particular military specializations. Former auxiliary officers who'd returned to tribal territories brought sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic planning, siege warfare techniques, and coordination required for large-scale military operations against fortified positions. The breakthrough operations of 248 AD overwhelmed Roman frontier defenses through simultaneous attacks at multiple crossing points along the Danube, preventing effective Roman response coordination. Archaeological excavations at destroyed Roman frontier posts show evidence of coordinated assault techniques combining direct frontal attacks with flanking movements designed to collapse defensive perimeters through multiple simultaneous pressures. Penetration raids extended deep into Roman provincial territories, with archaeological evidence of destruction appearing at sites hundreds of kilometers from the Danube frontier. Unlike earlier incursions focusing on portable wealth and rapid withdrawal, these campaigns demonstrated systematic territorial objectives, including establishment of permanent bases within Roman provinces. The demographic pressures driving Germanic expansion originated from massive population movements throughout northern and eastern Europe, as Gothic tribes migrating westward displaced established Germanic populations. Archaeological evidence from sites in modern Poland and eastern Germany shows widespread settlement abandonment during mid-3rd century, with distinctive material culture assemblages indicating westward movement of substantial population groups. What happened next would scatter the Marcomanni across Europe like seeds in a storm. The Gothic expansion represented fundamental transformation of the demographic and political landscape throughout Central and Eastern Europe. These highly organized tribal confederations possessed military capabilities exceeding those of established Germanic groups, while maintaining sufficient political cohesion to coordinate large-scale territorial conquests. The pressure exerted by eastward-moving Gothic populations forced traditional Marcomannic communities to make difficult strategic choices regarding territorial holdings and political alliances. Archaeological evidence from Bohemian sites during mid-3rd century shows significant population movements as established communities abandoned ancestral territories rather than face incorporation into Gothic political systems. Some Marcomannic groups chose integration with Gothic confederations, accepting subordinate status within larger political entities in exchange for protection and participation in successful military campaigns against Roman territories. Archaeological evidence for this integration appears in material culture assemblages combining traditional Marcomannic pottery and metalwork styles with Gothic decorative elements and technological innovations. Other Marcomannic populations pursued westward migration toward territories controlled by the Alemannic Confederation, which was simultaneously expanding its influence throughout the Upper Rhine region and southwestern Germany. The Alemannic political system offered attractive alternatives to Gothic domination, as their confederation maintained greater internal autonomy for member tribes while providing effective military coordination. Archaeological evidence from Alemannic territories shows appearance of distinctive Marcomannic material culture elements during later 3rd century, indicating successful integration of refugee populations into existing tribal structures. The military contributions that Marcomannic warriors provided to Alemannic Confederation forces proved particularly valuable during extensive campaigns conducted against Roman territories throughout Gaul and northern Italy during the 260s and 270s AD. The broader Germanic migrations of the 4th century AD encompassed Marcomannic populations within massive demographic movements, fundamentally transforming the ethnic and political landscape of Western Europe. The Hunnic expansion westward from Pontic steppes created irresistible pressure, forcing virtually all Germanic tribal groups to abandon traditional territories and seek new homelands within or beyond Roman provincial boundaries. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Central Europe shows widespread abandonment during late 4th century, with entire regional populations disappearing from the archaeological record as they joined massive migration streams flowing toward Western Europe and the Mediterranean region. The border warriors were scattering to the winds. Marcomannic participation in these migrations occurred primarily through integration with larger tribal confederations rather than as independent political entities, reflecting demographic and political fragmentation that had characterized communities since the 3rd century crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that former Marcomannic populations contributed to multiple migration streams, with some groups joining Visigothic movements toward Gaul and Spain, while others became incorporated into Vandal confederations that eventually reached North Africa. The dispersal across such extensive geographic areas effectively ended any possibility of maintaining distinct Marcomannic political or cultural identity. Roman sources from late 4th and early 5th centuries increasingly refer to former Marcomannic territories using geographic rather than ethnic designations, indicating complete dissolution of recognizable tribal political structures in these regions. Administrative documents describe establishment of Roman defensive positions and settlement colonies in areas previously identified with specific Germanic tribal groups, suggesting demographic displacement had created territorial vacuums that Roman authorities attempted to fill through systematic colonization efforts. The final historical mentions of identifiably Marcomannic populations appear in chronicles describing establishment of Germanic kingdoms within former Roman provincial territories during 5th century AD. These references typically describe small groups or individual leaders claiming Marcomannic ancestry while serving within administrative or military hierarchies of Visigothic Vandal or other Germanic royal courts. The scattered nature of these references suggests that Marcomannic identity had become primarily genealogical rather than political, maintained by individuals and families who preserved ancestral memories while participating fully in new political structures emerging from collapse of Roman imperial authority in Western Europe. Archaeological evidence for dissolution of distinct Marcomannic cultural identity appears in material culture record through gradual disappearance of characteristic pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and burial practices that had previously distinguished Marcomannic communities from neighboring Germanic groups. Sites dating to 5th and 6th centuries AD in former Marcomannic territories show material culture assemblages reflecting regional rather than tribal characteristics, indicating emergence of new cultural identities based on geographic proximity and political affiliation rather than ancestral tribal connections. The Marcomanni were fading into history, but their legacy would endure in unexpected ways. The linguistic evidence for Marcomannic cultural dissolution appears in disappearance of distinctive dialectical features that had previously characterized their Germanic language variety. Comparative analysis of Germanic language development suggests that former Marcomannic linguistic elements became absorbed into broader regional dialects, reflecting mixed populations created by migration and resettlement processes. The linguistic integration paralleled material culture changes documented through archaeological evidence, indicating comprehensive cultural transformation, eliminating distinctive characteristics that had previously defined Marcomannic identity. Yet paradoxically, as the Marcomanni disappeared as a distinct people, their influence on European development became more profound. The organizational innovations pioneered by Maroboduus, centralized administration, standardized military equipment, systematic training programs, diplomatic engagement with major powers, became templates that later Germanic kingdoms would adopt and adapt. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, all showed evidence of governmental structures influenced by earlier Marcomannic experiments in state building. The military traditions that Marcomannic warriors had perfected through centuries of conflict, the combination of Germanic warrior courage with Roman tactical discipline, the integration of different tribal contingents into coordinated forces, the development of siege warfare capabilities, these became standard features of successful Germanic military systems throughout the migration period and into the early Middle Ages. Former Marcomannic auxiliary officers who'd served in Roman armies transmitted this military expertise across Europe, influencing tactical development in ways that historians are still tracing through archaeological and textual evidence. The diplomatic precedents established through Marcomannic negotiations with Rome, the concept of client kingdoms maintaining internal autonomy while accepting external constraints, the use of tribute and military service as alternatives to direct conquest, the development of formalized treaty relationships between imperial powers and tribal entities, these innovations shaped Romano-Germanic relations throughout the late Empire and influenced how barbarian successor kingdoms interacted with Byzantine imperial authority. What the Marcomanni had pioneered in Bohemia became the diplomatic language of an entire era. Their political experiments, born from necessity and desperation, left fingerprints across medieval European governance that scholars are still discovering today. Modern archaeological preservation of Marcomannic culture has become increasingly sophisticated through systematic excavations and museum curation efforts throughout the Czech Republic and Austria. The National Museum in Prague houses one of the world's most comprehensive collections of Marcomannic artifacts, including spectacular grave goods discovered at Muszów in southern Moravia during the 1980s. This burial assemblage, dating to late 1st century AD, contains a complete set of warrior equipment, including a pattern-welded sword with silver inlay work, an iron spearhead with bronze socket decoration, and a shield boss featuring intricate geometric patterns demonstrating highest levels of Marcomannic metalwork craftsmanship. Ongoing excavations at Stare Hradisko near Prostějov have revealed extensive evidence of Marcomannic settlement organization and daily life, providing crucial insights into their social structure and economic activities. The site encompasses approximately 40 hectares of well-preserved settlement remains dating from 1st century BC through 2nd century AD, making it one of the largest continuously occupied Germanic sites in Central Europe. Excavations have uncovered over 200 individual structures, including residential buildings, craft workshops, storage facilities, and what appears to be a central administrative complex that may have served governmental functions during the kingdom period. Recent excavations at Bratislava Castle have uncovered substantial evidence of Marcomannic occupation during early centuries AD, including defensive fortifications and residential structures demonstrating the strategic importance of this Danube crossing point. The archaeological team has identified multiple construction phases corresponding to different periods of Marcomannic political development, from initial settlement establishment through kingdom period and subsequent Roman client-state arrangements. Particularly significant are wooden writing tablets discovered in waterlogged deposits, which preserve Germanic runic inscriptions representing some of the earliest examples of indigenous literacy among Central European tribal populations. The Naturhistorisches Museum in Vienna maintains extensive collections of Marcomannic artifacts recovered from sites throughout Austria, with particular strength in military equipment and personal ornaments illustrating warrior culture that defined Marcomannic society. The museum's research program has conducted systematic analysis of metalworking techniques used in Marcomannic weapon production, revealing sophisticated understanding of iron metallurgy that produced blades comparable in quality to contemporary Roman military equipment. These weren't primitive barbarians, they were skilled craftsmen whose work rivaled anything the civilized world could produce. The influence of Marcomannic military and political traditions on later Germanic tribal formations appears most clearly in organizational structures adopted by the Alemannic Confederation during 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Archaeological evidence from Alemannic sites shows adoption of fortification techniques and settlement planning principles directly paralleling methods developed during Maroboduus's kingdom, suggesting former Marcomannic populations transmitted their governmental and military expertise to new political affiliations. The Alemannic military system incorporated elements of standardized equipment production and coordinated tactical formations that had characterized Marcomannic forces, creating hybrid military traditions combining multiple Germanic influences with Roman organizational principles. The transmission of Marcomannic political concepts influenced development of early medieval Germanic kingdoms through former tribal members who achieved positions of authority within Visigothic, Vandal, and other royal administrations. Chronicle sources from 6th and 7th centuries reference individuals claiming Marcomannic ancestry who served as military commanders and administrative officials in these kingdoms, bringing organizational experience that contributed to sophisticated governmental structures characterizing successful Germanic successor states. The legal codes developed by these kingdoms show evidence of Germanic customary law traditions, including elements traceable to Marcomannic judicial practices, particularly regarding property rights and military service obligations, reflecting tributary systems originally developed under Roman client-state arrangements. The impact of Marcomannic resistance on Roman frontier policy extended far beyond immediate military consequences of their conflicts with imperial forces. The Marcomannic Wars demonstrated that Germanic tribal confederations could pose existential threats to Roman territorial integrity when they achieved sufficient political unity and military organization, forcing fundamental reassessment of frontier defensive strategies throughout imperial period. Roman response involved systematic development of client-state relationships seeking to prevent emergence of unified Germanic threats, while maintaining territorial security through cooperative tribal leadership rather than direct military occupation of hostile territories. The Danubian defensive strategies developed during and after Marcomannic Wars established precedents for frontier management influencing imperial administration throughout subsequent centuries. Integration of Germanic auxiliary forces into Roman military structures reflected lessons learned about effectiveness of tribal military traditions when properly coordinated with Roman tactical discipline and logistical capabilities. The diplomatic protocols established through Roman negotiations with Maroboduus created institutional frameworks for managing relationships with powerful tribal entities that served as models for similar arrangements throughout empire's northern frontiers. Every subsequent frontier policy carried Marcomannic DNA. Modern historical interpretation of the Marcomanni has evolved significantly as archaeological evidence has provided more nuanced understanding of their political sophistication and cultural achievements. Earlier historical narratives portraying them primarily as barbarian raiders threatening Roman civilization have been replaced by recognition of their role as political innovators who created some of the most advanced governmental institutions in pre-medieval Europe. Contemporary scholarship emphasizes their contributions to development of Germanic political organization and their influence on evolution of Romano-Germanic diplomatic relationships that shaped transition from classical antiquity to early medieval period. The Marcomanni's place in broader narrative of Germanic-Roman interaction illustrates complex processes of cultural exchange and political adaptation characterizing frontier relationships throughout imperial period. Rather than representing simple opposition between civilized Romans and barbarian Germans, the history demonstrates sophisticated diplomatic and military interactions, creating hybrid cultural forms, combining elements from both traditions. Archaeological evidence shows these cultural syntheses produced innovations in governmental organization, military technology, and economic systems influencing subsequent European development in ways extending far beyond immediate participants in these interactions. The ethnogenesis processes characterizing early European development appear clearly in Marcomannic history through their transformation from traditional tribal organization to centralized kingdom and subsequent integration into larger confederation structures. Their experience illustrates how demographic pressures, military conflicts, and political opportunities combine to create new forms of political identity, transcending traditional tribal boundaries while maintaining cultural elements, providing continuity with ancestral traditions. The Marcomannic example demonstrates that ethnic identity in early Europe was fluid and adaptive rather than fixed, changing in response to political circumstances while preserving selected cultural elements, maintaining group cohesion across generations. The archaeological record of Marcomannic culture provides crucial evidence for understanding material conditions supporting political innovation and cultural development among Germanic populations during Roman period. Their settlements show evidence of economic specialization, craft production standardization, and trade network participation, creating material foundations necessary for supporting centralized political institutions and professional military forces. The quality and sophistication of their material culture demonstrates that Germanic societies possess technological capabilities and organizational skills necessary for creating complex political entities that could compete effectively with Roman imperial power when circumstances permitted unified action. They were empire builders in their own right. The Marcomanni ultimately represent one of the most significant examples of Germanic political development during Roman period, demonstrating both potential for tribal societies to create sophisticated governmental institutions and challenges they faced in maintaining political unity against external pressures and internal divisions. Their history provides essential insights into processes of cultural change and political adaptation, characterizing transition from classical antiquity to medieval Europe, while their archaeological remains continue yielding new information about daily life, technological capabilities, and cultural values in pre-medieval Germanic society. Consider what the Marcomanni achieved. From refugees fleeing the Cimbrian invasions, they became kingmakers in Ariovistus's confederation. From defeated warriors scattered after Vosges, they rebuilt themselves into a kingdom that negotiated with Rome as equals. From client states, fragmented and controlled, they launched invasions that required Rome's full military might to contain. From scattered populations absorbed into other peoples, they transmitted organizational and military innovations that shaped medieval Europe. At every stage, they adapted, evolved, and influenced the world around them, far beyond what their numbers alone would suggest. The legacy extends into modern historical consciousness through ongoing archaeological research revealing previously unknown aspects of Marcomannic society. Recent discoveries challenge simplistic narratives of Germanic barbarians versus Roman civilization, instead revealing complex societies with sophisticated material cultures, advanced technologies, and political innovations that contributed significantly to European development. The Marcomanni force us to reconsider what we mean by civilization and barbarian, categories that seem increasingly inadequate for describing the nuanced reality of ancient societies. But their story resonates today because it addresses timeless questions. How do peoples maintain identity while adapting to changing circumstances? How do small populations influence larger historical currents? What happens when traditional political structures prove inadequate for new challenges? How do defeated peoples transmit their legacy to future generations? The Marcomanni faced all these questions and found answers, sometimes successful, sometimes tragic, but always revealing something profound about human political organization and cultural survival. Though they disappeared as distinct people during 4th and 5th centuries AD, their legacy persists in institutional innovations, cultural traditions, and historical precedents influencing development of early medieval European civilization. They didn't just fade away. They transformed and merged, carrying their innovations into the bloodstream of European history. The border warriors' greatest achievement wasn't military victory or territorial conquest. It was demonstrating that Germanic peoples could create centralized states capable of sophisticated governance and strategic planning. Before Maroboduus, Germanic political organization operated through loose confederations and kinship networks that formed and dissolved around specific military objectives. After Maroboduus, the possibility of Germanic kingdoms with permanent administrative structures, professional armies, and diplomatic relationships with major powers became established reality. Every subsequent Germanic state builder looked back to the Marcomannic experiment, learning from both its successes and failures. The military innovations pioneered by Marcomannic warriors, the integration of Roman tactical discipline with Germanic warrior ethos, the development of standardized equipment production, the creation of coordinated multi-tribal forces, became standard features of Germanic warfare throughout migration period and beyond. The auxiliary units formed from Marcomannic populations transmitted these innovations throughout Roman Empire, influencing tactical development across multiple frontiers. When Germanic kingdoms eventually replaced Roman imperial authority in Western Europe, the military systems they employed reflected Marcomannic influence transmitted through centuries of cultural exchange and institutional development. The diplomatic precedents established through Marcomannic negotiations with Rome influenced how subsequent Germanic peoples approached relationships with imperial power. The concept of client kingdoms maintaining internal autonomy while accepting tributary obligations and military cooperation arrangements became standard framework for Romano-Germanic relations throughout late antiquity. When Visigothic, Vandal, and other Germanic leaders negotiated with Roman and Byzantine authorities, they employed diplomatic languages and institutional frameworks pioneered by Marcomannic predecessors who'd first demonstrated that Germanic peoples could engage with imperial powers as something other than enemies or conquered subjects. Perhaps most significantly, the Marcomanni demonstrated the fragility of tribal unity and the challenges of maintaining centralized authority among peoples who valued warrior democracy and consensus-based decision-making. Maroboduus's kingdom collapsed not through Roman military defeat, but through internal rebellion by traditionalists who rejected monarchical authority. This pattern, the tension between centralization necessary for effective governance and traditional values emphasizing distributed leadership, would recur throughout Germanic history, influencing political development well into medieval period. The Marcomanni learned these lessons through bitter experience. Their successors learned by studying Marcomannic failures. So what remains of the Marcomanni today? In the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria, archaeological sites continue yielding artifacts telling stories of sophisticated societies that challenged Rome's dominance in Central Europe. Museum collections preserve weapons, pottery, ornaments, and personal items connecting modern observers to individual Marcomanni who lived, fought, loved, and died centuries ago. Academic conferences debate interpretations of settlements, burial practices, and material culture, gradually building more complete pictures of peoples whose written records were created by their enemies and whose own voices survive only through material remains and fragmentary inscriptions. But the deepest legacy isn't in museums or archaeological sites, it's in the institutional and cultural DNA of European civilization itself. The governmental innovations, military traditions, and diplomatic precedents pioneered by the Marcomanni influenced every Germanic kingdom that followed. When medieval chroniclers wrote about ancient Germanic peoples, they included Marcomannic history as foundational narrative explaining origins of their own societies. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered classical sources describing Germanic tribes, Marcomannic resistance to Rome inspired emerging national consciousness throughout Central Europe. The border warriors became mythological ancestors claimed by multiple modern nations seeking historical legitimacy. The Marcomanni's story ultimately transcends narrow tribal history to illuminate universal processes of political development, cultural adaptation, and historical change. They demonstrated that small populations could influence vast historical currents through innovation and determination. They showed that defeat need not be permanent, that refugees could rebuild themselves into kingdoms, that fragmented peoples could transmit legacies across generations, that the powerless could eventually challenge the powerful. They proved that barbarian and civilized were inadequate categories for describing complex societies creating their own sophisticated cultures outside classical Mediterranean frameworks. From forest settlements along the main river to the kingdom in Bohemia, from catastrophic defeats to temporary triumphs, from client states to invading armies. From distinct tribal identity to absorption into broader European populations, the Marcomanni travelled a journey spanning 7 centuries and transforming them repeatedly. They disappeared as a people, but persisted as an influence, their innovations and adaptations woven into the fabric of European history. The border warriors are gone, but their legacy endures wherever historians study the transition from classical to medieval Europe, wherever archaeologists excavate Germanic settlements, wherever anyone asks how small peoples shape great histories. If you've found this journey through Marcomannic history as fascinating as I have, please subscribe for more deep dives into the peoples and events that shaped our world.